All right, so this lesson we are going to talk about influences and how America was shifted because of what was going on in Europe. Um, so the question, of course, is while the colonists were coming to America, what was happening in England? So while we have exciting things, a lot of people are coming to America. There's still a lot of stuff happening over here, and there's stuff that has already happened, and we really need to explore that. So that big thing is called the Enlightenment. Now, hopefully, you've heard of the Enlightenment before, but it is very much what it is called. That people started getting new ideas. So they would have these huge we really shouldn't call them meetings. They were getting together and they were exploring new ideas. They would call them salons, and they were happening all over Europe. It wasn't just England, but in France and in Germany and in Italy, people are getting together and they're having conversation. Now, if you've noticed in this picture, we don't just have men. There's also women sitting here, which is also a relatively new idea that a woman can be included in this conversation. They can actually sit there and think about things. That they can have open discussions about where where did the power come from for the king, and what type of things should be allowed to be said in the home versus in the church. You would have smaller gatherings, of course, men and women getting together, and they would read books together. They would explore new ideas. They would actually have open conversations which would have debate. Not so much, I mean, you could say they were arguing, but then they were also just exploring the idea of new thoughts being allowed. We also have the idea that human beings have rights. Now, with any great thing, there's typically people who are behind the scenes. Maybe people are if they're reading these books, who wrote those books? So we really kind of have to back up and we have to talk about the principles of our government. Principles that came from somewhere, of course, and we're going to talk about those philosophers. But when we say principles, we're not talking about like the principle of a school. We're talking about things that you just believe. And so here are 6 fundamental principles, things that we just believe in our government. The first would be separation of powers. And that would be the idea that we're going to have 3 branches of government, and no one branch is going to be have all the power, because they would have too much power. The example that we end up having here is that we've got a legislative branch, an executive, and judicial. One is going to make the law, one's going to enforce, and one's going to interpret. Equality and rule of law is another principle. And these 2 things, the first stating that everyone is going to be born the same. The idea of just because you have money doesn't necessarily mean that you are better or superior to somebody. And then the other one, the rule of law, states that everyone must follow the law. Now, if we look back at separation of powers, which was created by Montesquieu, Baron de Montesquieu came up with this one. Now, our Constitution is framed after this one, as well as equality and the rule of law. Both of those principles are in our Constitution. We also see the idea of the consent of the governed. Now, if you will make sure you have this on your paper. Consent means permission. So we have permission of the governed, not the government, but the governed. So you have the government who would guide people, and then the governed are the people underneath the government. The social contract states that there is an agreement between the government and the people, that the people are going to give up rights in order to be protected. The government says, I will protect you from bad things. We will send out people to stop crime and to have an orderly society. However, the people must give up certain rights and certain freedoms. For example, we have given up the right to run into a building and yell there, fire or bomb. However, that means if I'm sitting in a theater, or if I'm in, Walmart or Target, and someone comes in and they yell that, and we act appropriately because that would be a terrifying moment. And that if this person is lying and they are not telling the truth, then that means that they are going to be arrested for doing that. So we give up rights in order to be protected. That we can't run around just shooting anybody that we want to just because somebody made me angry. However, then that means that we are not only, so we can't do that, but other people can't do it to us either. Then we also have this idea of a natural right, just like if your hair has a natural color to it, that means that the color that you're born with. Unalienable means, so alien means foreign. If you have an alien object in your body, then that means you have an object that doesn't belong there. So if it's an unalien, then that means it does belong. These are rights that you are born with. John Locke is the man responsible for this idea that we later include in several important documents. John Locke he said it would be life, liberty, and property are your 3 rights that you would be born with. Now, later on, Thomas Jefferson ends up doing a very similar idea. Thomas Jefferson is the author of the Declaration of Independence, and in the Declaration of Independence, he writes life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, meaning we have the right to go try to find our happiness, which is slightly different than property, and hopefully you talked about that in world history. Our next principle, it would be limited government, and that is exactly as it sounds, that the government should have limits on what it can do. That if the government misbehaves and it's not doing as it should, then the people have a right to stand up and say, this is not right, and we should be upset about this. The idea that a president like Richard Nixon, who wasn't following the law, he said he was above the law, and later the people, the government, the press came in and they said, no, there are limits on your power. And then our final one would be self-government, which is also just what it sounds like. The idea that you can govern yourself, that no one is in charge of telling you what to do when it comes to managing what's going on with yourself. Now, of course, we still have to go with that whole social contract thing, and that, that we do give up some of our rights. However, some examples would be our first representative government. Our first representative democracy was the House of Burgesses, and that, the people came to America and they created a government to govern themselves. A second example would be our first direct democracy, and that would be when the Pilgrims created the Mayflower Compact and said that all men are going to govern, that no one is going to be more powerful than another. So we do have to give credit where credit's due, of course, and so we've got 4 philosophers that we look at who are really responsible for a huge chunk of these principles. Locke, of course, he wrote about natural rights, our life, liberty, and property. Montesquieu wrote about separation of powers, the idea that we should have 3 branches of government to prevent tyranny is what he said. And tyranny would be the abuse of power. Rousseau said the social contract. Rousseau is also the one who came in and expressed that all men are created equal. And then we have Hobbes, who also wrote about the social contract. However, there is a slight difference between Rousseau and Hobbes. Well, when I say slight, there's a huge difference between these two. While they both wrote about the social contract, we need to specify a little bit about what the difference is. Hobbes believed that once the government would give permission for once the people gave permission to the government, then the government had complete and total control, and the people could do absolutely nothing about it. Versus Rousseau believed that if the government does not do its job, then the people should get rid of the government and create a new government. A relevant example for this would be if we consider the summer, it seemed like a summer, but it was quite a bit longer, in which we had suddenly seen a huge rise in police on civilian shootings. And some of these incidents seemed uncalled for. And what in the world is going on? The people should rise up and say, we have a problem with what the government is doing. And if the government does not handle that, then that means that we should overthrow the government. Did we do that? All right, so let's review real quick. This is actually on a warm-up paper. That we need to make sure that we understand that the power of the king was first attempted to be limited by the Magna Carta. Remember that attempt. In fact, I really want you to write that down because you're going to see that again. The king was not officially limited until we have the English Bill of Rights. In England, we have a parliament, and parliament is their legislator, which means that they make laws for England today. So taxes and whatnot are decided by parliament, which is their legislator. Parliament, which that's the legislator, officially became more powerful than the king during the Glorious Revolution, which if we go back to one of the earlier videos, the Glorious Revolution was so glorious because it was a change, because revolution means change, a glorious revolution because nobody died. This was when the king and queen gave up their power and nobody died. Common law is a system based on precedents, so that we know what's going to happen based on what's happened before. That judges would say, oh, you stole something, so you lose a finger. Well, how will the next person know what's going to happen? It's because of precedents. John Locke wrote a book called The Second Treatise on Natural Rights, which stated that we have 3 natural rights, natural being what you're born with, life, liberty, property. The idea that you have to give up some power in order to be protected would be called a social contract, and that would be created by a man named Rousseau. And that Baron de Montesquieu said that we should have separation of powers, that we should have someone to make the laws, someone to enforce the laws, and someone to interpret those laws to make sure that they are fair. And then that's it.